Hello, welcome back. We're going to try this again. Sorry, folks that were that out there in cyber world, and the folks here visited among themselves. So we'll start over. So the topic for tonight is the advent of clergy women in Mississippi Conference, and I was going to introduce some clergy women first. Of course, our speaker is Reverend Dr. Joe Reiff, but his wife Becky, who is here with us, and is still a member of the Holston Conference, served in Abingdon, and she and her husband Joe were the first clergy couple who served local churches in their conference back in the early 80s. Is that correct? We also have another clergy woman I want to make sure everyone knows is Mary Kay Briggs, who was the minister to the campus at Emory and Henry College for 12 years. And she is now the director of the Wesley Foundation here at the UT campus. So raise your hand, Mary Kay. So she is, when you talk about campus ministry, you say that Mary Kay is our campus minister and that she is ministering to our college folks. When we talk about Methodism, we say we are a connectional church, and we begin to talk about connections. Do you know so-and-so? Do you know so-and-so? And if you don't know so-and-so, then you move to, well, do you know this institution? Or do you know this conference? So you are in the Holston Conference. Joe Reiff is from the Mississippi Conference group in Jackson, Mississippi. Went to Millsaps College. Many of you went to Emory and Henry College, or Tennessee Wesleyan University, or maybe Hiawassee College here in the Holston Conference. After he served in Mississippi for a while, he moved to Candler School of Theology. That's where he went to seminary, was at Candler School of Theology, and then went back to Mississippi, served, it's okay, all right, and then went to Emory and Henry, where Mary Kay was, but before Mary Kay was there, and was chair of the religion department, as professor of religion at Emory and Henry, has recently retired. He has written a book that those of you, especially in the Conversations on Race group, I'm sure you have a copy, Born of Conviction, which is about the 28 white Methodist clergy in 1963 who published a statement in the Mississippi about what Christians should do about race relations in the church. And it's a fascinating history, just all the interviewing those people and getting their stories. So Dr. Reiff is a historian, a theologian, a minister, and an all-around good guy. He is going to talk to us. I will quit introducing you and let you come up and talk about your topic. And as a clergy woman, I'm excited to hear about my sisters from the Mississippi Conference. So thank you, Dr. Reiff.
All right.
Yay.
I think we're ready to go. So I was here 5 years ago this month for 4 Sunday mornings to talk about the Born of Conviction book, White Methodists and Mississippi's Closed Society. Tonight, and so I was presenting on a finished book. I'm not doing that tonight. We are in the same state, Mississippi, different topic, but not on a finished book. If this research does become a book, and that's still a big if, I've got a long way to go. But part of my desire is to tell the stories of some United Methodist clergy women who faced various obstacles and resistance along the way as they sought to pursue their calling. Now you might ask, why me? Well, I do know Mississippi. I was a United Methodist pastor in Mississippi for a few years in the 1980s. And most importantly, I was and still am married to one of the first clergy women in the Mississippi Conference, and she's here with us tonight. So, all right, I'm trying to advance this, and it's not advancing.
I would have. Use your arrows.
Yeah, I did, but okay, there we go.
I
All
just
right.
had to be up here with you.
So those of you who are here, you see pictures of ministers who were ordained in the Mississippi Annual Conference in 1961. What are the two things that you notice about those folks? They are all what?
White.
They're all men and they're all white. That's correct. The Methodist ministry was, for a long time, a man's world. In fact, Methodist ministers in annual conferences, in the South for sure, but also other places, were often just referred to as the men. And I imagine there's a couple of folks in this room who remember that. So I want to tell you a story to illustrate some of the difficulties as we began this transition to having clergy women. In 1975, I was still in college. I drove with my parents one night up to Grenada, Mississippi, in the north part of the state, for the North Mississippi Annual Conference Ordination Service. And we went because Terry Bailoff, a woman who had been my dad's student assistant, my dad taught religion at Bill Sass for 30 plus years, was being ordained a deacon that night. She was the only woman being ordained. She wasn't the first, but she was the only woman being ordained that night. There was a guest preacher, a bishop from another conference, and when he got up to preach the ordination sermon, he made a couple of preliminary remarks, and then he said, I'm going to speak now mainly to the men who are being ordained. Well, Bishop Max Stokes, to his credit, the bishop in Mississippi, said out loud, there's a woman too. And so he sort of adjusted his what he was saying. But, it was pretty deeply ingrained here. So in 1961, where all these men were ordained, and I used these pictures, by the way, in the Board of Conviction book, because there are a few ministers in this picture who signed the Board of Conviction statement. It was hard for anyone in 1961 to imagine an integrated conference. That happened 12 years later in 1973, or that there would be any clergy women serving in that conference. So here's another picture from 1962, which I'm using because I want you to notice the man on the far left. His name is Keith Tonkel. This is 1962. And then we're going to fast forward 50 years to the 2011 ordination service at the Mississippi Annual Conference, now the whole state of Mississippi. So that is a woman being ordained elder. Her name is Michelle Schrader. That is Keith Tonkel standing there. He's an elder participating in the service. She asked him to do that because she had worked as his associate pastor in Jackson for the previous 3 years. And lo and behold, there is a woman bishop, Hope Morgan Ward, who was the bishop in Mississippi from 2004 to 2012. So one of the ways to summarize what this lecture is about, how did we get from here to here? So, I want to do just a very brief Methodist history lesson. We're going to focus mainly on the top half of that. Below is all of the predecessor groups that formed the EUB Church that united with the Methodist Church in 1968. But up top, sort of in the middle of that progression, the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Now, I did a little homework, and I know that this congregation was a part of the ME Church South when it was founded until 1939. But you also had the Methodist Protestant Church, which had split off 14 years before the North-South split over slavery. The Methodist Protestants left primarily because they didn't want bishops. So, in 1939, the Northern Church, the ME Church, the Southern Church, the ME Church South, and the Methodist Protestants, who were still around, fairly small denomination, unified into what we called the Methodist Church. And I spent the time doing that because when I started this research, one of the things that I discovered was that in Mississippi, between 1900 and 1939, there were actually 11 Methodist Protestant women who established some kind of relationship with that conference, the Methodist Protestant Mississippi Conference. 4 of them actually served as pastors of churches, a couple of others for at least a year. A couple of others assisted men in pastoral duties in the church. But let's focus just on the first one, Mrs. M.M. Merchant, who received a license to preach in 1900, that's 121 years ago, folks, in Mississippi. And then in 1903 was ordained elder because the Methodist Protestant General Church and the Mississippi Conference were, this is a quote from a book about the Mississippi Methodist Protestants, were by no means unanimous in favor of ordaining her, but there was a rather reluctant, yielding opinion that permitted it. So they didn't really want to, but they did. And I think that's pretty remarkable, actually. Now, the other thing to note is that in 1939, when the Methodist Protestants unified with the northern and southern churches, the Methodist Protestant women gave up their clergy status. The ones in Mississippi do not appear in the journal for the new Mississippi Conference of the Methodist Church. So, also a little bit about Mississippi Methodism. So one of the things you need to remember, North and South Division, from 1939 until 1973, there were 4 annual conferences in Mississippi. Why? Because of the central jurisdiction, the separate, segregated jurisdiction for African Americans. And there was an Upper Mississippi annual conference, that was black, that covered the same territory as the North Mississippi Conference, which was the white conference in the southeastern jurisdiction. And there was an African American Mississippi Conference, the southern half of the state, part of the central jurisdiction, as well as the white Mississippi Conference, also the southern half of the state in the southeastern jurisdiction. Those conferences merged black and white in 1973 to form the North Mississippi Conference and the Mississippi Conference. And since 1989, there has been 1 annual conference in Mississippi. Okay, so the other thing I discovered was that there were actually about 5 African American women in the Black Mississippi Conference, which was part of the ME Church, the Northern Church, before 1939, and then was a part of the central jurisdiction. They were approved supply pastors, except for the last one, Margaret Bess, who was received on trial. That doesn't mean you're in trouble. It means you're a probationary member in the annual conference. She worked at the Mississippi Rural Center in Marion County, sort of west of Hattiesburg. It's kind of like a social worker, I guess. I never found any evidence that she was ordained deacon, and her on-trial status was ended a few years later. The most significant person here is Mabel Cochran, who from 1949 through 1965 or 66, as an approved supply pastor, a lay person who had had a license to preach, served churches on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So, in 1959, at a Sunday night service at Salem Methodist Church in the Union County community of Etta, Mississippi, it's in northeast Mississippi, a little bit west of Tupelo, Ruth Wood, who was a 34-year-old wife and mother, experienced a profound sense of calling. She all of a sudden felt that the eyes of the portrait of Jesus on the wall in the sanctuary, and I don't know that it was Warner Solomon's Head of Christ, but it probably was, but the eyes of that portrait were upon her, were focused on her, she felt. And she had this message that she received in her mind, which went like this: the eyes of Jesus are upon you. What are you going to do about it? Now, after that experience, she didn't tell anybody about it for a couple of days, and then she went to see her pastor, who of course was a man, and he did not dismiss her experience, but he did tell her that the Methodist Church would not allow women to preach. And guess what? This was 1959. He was wrong. Here's just a little bit of history here. In 1920, the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Northern Church, granted women the right to be licensed as local preachers. No ordination, but they could be assigned to a local church to preach. In 1924, they gave women limited clergy rights as local elders or deacons without conference membership. And one thing you need to understand, ordination and conference membership are two separate things. Always has been, probably always will be in the Methodist tradition. Now, those two events took place in the Northern Church, the Emmy Church. In 1930, there was a proposal at the General Conference in the Emmy Church South to approve full clergy rights for women. It failed. It was voted down. Once we had the unification in 1939, 3 general conferences in a row, 44, 48, and 52, the Women's Society of Christian Service, the Methodist Church, the predecessor of the UMW, what we call the UMW now, petitioned the General Conference for full clergy rights for women, and it was voted down every time. But finally, in 1956, the Methodist Church's General Conference approved full clergy rights to women. Now, within a few weeks, so back to Ruth Wood, within a few weeks, the story of her experience had gotten to the district superintendent, who was a man named George Williams. Came time for quarterly conference. They still had quarterly conferences then in 1959. Reverend Williams and his wife had dinner with Ruth and her husband, Huey, before the quarterly conference. And Ruth asked George Williams, "Will my church let me respond to this call?" Now, this is 1959 in rural North Mississippi. And Reverend Williams said, "Your church will let you do whatever God calls you to do." So that night at the quarterly conference, she was approved for the first steps for a license to preach, no dissenting votes. And a few weeks later, her husband, Huey, also presented himself for a license to preach, and he was approved. So in mid-1959, they were appointed to a 7-church charge, the Boonville charge, about 25 miles north of Tupelo. Huey was appointed as the pastor, and get ready for it, Ruth was appointed as his unpaid associate. Now, a constant theme in this presentation tonight is that Mississippi bishops and cabinets for a long time had no idea what to do with women preachers. But they did let her preach. So Ruth's story includes several points where she asked God for some kind of sign and she wasn't quite sure she was on the right path. And a few weeks after they were appointed to the Boonville charge, the word started going around among the people in the church that God had called Ruth mainly to get to her husband, that she was the vehicle for his calling. Well, this really bothered Ruth because she believed, she had nothing against her husband. She was glad he was doing it too. But she truly believed she was called by God. So one morning she was supposed to preach at Liberty and Grace churches on that charge. And so before she started the first service, she asked God to show her something, to give her some guidance on this. Nothing happened unusual at Liberty. But at the end of the service at Grace, a woman in the front row stood up and began shouting praise to God in a Methodist church, in a white Methodist church. Ruth decided that's unusual. So she saw that as a sign from God. And the next year, unrelated to the sign, she started receiving a salary. They finally figured out, okay, we've got to pay her. Ruth finished her college degree, and she wanted to go to seminary, but settled for the Methodist Church's course of study program, which enabled her to be ordained deacon in 1961, and elder in 1964, but it also delayed her conference membership process for a little while. She was finally received on trial, probationary member, in 1965. And in 1967, she became the first full clergy member in full connection in the North Mississippi Annual Conference, and the first one in the Mississippi Methodist Church. She served various other places. In 1972, she was appointed sole pastor of Box Chapel in Corinth. She and Huey both served until 1989 when they retired. Now, I've got here a list. There's a very nice book that was put out a few years ago by the Board of Higher Education and Ministry about women clergy pioneers. And one of the things they do is they list the first woman in full connection in every annual conference. Now notice here that, and I've got two slides here, that the central jurisdiction, the East Tennessee Conference, which was in this area of the central jurisdiction, had the first two women received into full connection in the Methodist Church in 1958, the Georgia Central Jurisdiction Conference. Also, you also see the Central Alabama Conference and the Louisville Conference. But then there's Ruth Wood in 1967. So among the white conferences, North Mississippi was fifth among the SEJ annual conferences. Here's the rest of the conferences. You see the top of the second column, Brenda Carroll was the first in the Holston Annual Conference. And down at the bottom, the last conference, not only in the SEJ, but in the entire United Methodist connection in the United States, except for the two missionary conferences, was the Mississippi Annual Conference. And you're going to hear more about Dale's story in just a minute. So, once again, I remind you, North Mississippi and Mississippi stayed that way until 1989. This is a picture of some women pastors in North Mississippi taken in 1974. Because the conference had accepted Ruth Wood, this kind of paved the way by the early 1970s for some other women. Several of the four of them were also ministers' wives. One of them is not pictured here. The second full connection member was received in 1973. She's on the right of the photo, the far right. The one of these that is not married to a minister is second from the right, Virginia Allen, and you're going to hear a little more about her story in just a minute. So, we go to the Mississippi Conference now and to Jackson, Mississippi. When my family moved to Jackson in 1960, we joined Capitol Street Methodist Church. And there were two, in 1960, they were young teenagers, Mary Ann McDonald and Virginia Allen, who were members of that church, who eventually went to Millsaps College, graduated in 1969, and both went to seminary. Now, Mary Ann's story is a little different. The summer after her junior year in college, 1968, she spent the summer in the Pacific Northwest Conference working with youth at a church there. The minister happened to have come from Mississippi a few years before, and she knew him. While she was there, she met this handsome fella on the right in the second picture, and they got married. Jeff Swinson. They got married. She became Mary Ann McDonald Swinson. They, after she graduated from Millsaps, they moved out to Tacoma, Washington, and she was working with the youth in a church there. She returned to Capitol Street Church and was approved for a license to preach. She went to seminary at Claremont School of Theology. She joined the Pacific Northwest Conference, served as a pastor, district superintendent, and in 1992 she was elected bishop. She is now retired. I think the picture on the left, Mary Ann's about the age that she was when my family first met her. So both Mary Ann and Virginia were students of my dad. He was chair of the religion department at Millsaps. Virginia's story gets a little more complicated. She graduated as a religion major along with Mary Ann from Millsaps in 1969. Went to seminary at Perkins School of Theology in Dallas at SMU. And in her senior year, she contacted her district superintendent in Mississippi, whom she knew because he had been a pastor at Capitol Street a few years earlier, to say that she wanted to start the steps to become a probationary member of the ordained deacon and receive an appointment when she graduated. He told her that the Mississippi Conference would not ordain her and would not accept her. And he sent her a letter to that effect after she went back to Dallas. In May of that year, the Charge Conference, I guess it was Charge Conference by then, was meeting at Capitol Street. And she had applied to be voted on to receive a license to preach. The minister of the church wrote her and told her that he was going to recommend against it. She was not able to be present for the event, that he was going to recommend against it. He said, "It was my statement that I did not want to see you hurt on a conference level, and to avoid this, you have to be voted down on a local level." But the church members of the Charge Conference, administrative board, whatever it was, approved her anyway. I think part of their thinking was, we know her, we approved Mary Ann, why shouldn't we approve Virginia? Here's where the North Mississippi Conference comes in. Roy McAlilly was the father of Bill McAlilly, who's now the bishop in Nashville. Roy was the DS in the New Albany district. He had, earlier in his career, served the Salem Friendship Charge. That name should sound familiar to you because that's where Ruth and Huey Wood came from. That's where Ruth had her experience. That was the church that approved her for a license to preach. They needed a pastor. And so he appointed Virginia to the Salem Friendship Charge in North Mississippi. In 1973, she was ordained deacon, received as a probationary member. She had finished a year there, but a couple of factors, the death of her mother that year, and also she says, I'm a city girl, and that was kind of rough living in the country. She decided to leave. The church was willing to have her back. The charge was willing to have her back for another year. She decided to leave and return to Perkins for some more education. She eventually became a hospital chaplain, spent her career in Missouri, but she was ordained elder and received as a full connection member in North Mississippi in '77 and kept her membership there. So in 1975, the picture on the left is of the deacons' ordinands from that story I told you at the beginning of the presentation where the bishop said, I want to speak to the men. That's Terry Bailiff, second from the left, who was ordained deacon that night. On the right is a picture of Mississippi students at Candler School of Theology, probably in early 1975. And in the middle there is Terry Bailiff, who you see over on the left. But lo and behold, there's another woman there. And her name is Dale Owen. Her husband, LaRue, who's also in the photo, had decided to go into ministry, and they moved to Atlanta in 1974. And it had never occurred to Dale that women could be in the ministry. She was working on the Emory campus and one day saw for the first time a woman in a clergy collar. And she realized that women could be in ministry. She had grown up Baptist, but had always been deeply committed to the church and to her spirituality. And so she decided to start taking classes as well while she was working. So she began working as an administrative assistant to some Candler professors. She'd go to her classes, she'd come back and do her work. But eventually, she had to make the decision whether she was going to be full-time and take supervised ministry and all this. And so she did. And that led to finally the first deacons ordained in the Mississippi Conference, the southern half of the state, in 1975. The way Dale tells this story is she and Maru were getting ready for the service. She thought she was the only woman, and there were two others. So in the picture on the right, on the left is a woman named Linda Van Dyke. She was a student at Yale Divinity School. On the right is a woman named Marion Miles. Both of these women were ordained deacon that night, but neither persisted in the Methodist ministry. I think Linda became an Episcopal priest. Marion Miles shifted to the CME church and was ordained there. But one of the things Dale remembers about meeting with the Board of Ordained Ministry to be approved for that was, of course, the board was all men. And she remembers one minister in particular saying at one point to her, "What'd somebody like you want to be in the ministry for?" Now, she was pretty sweet and shy then. She kind of changed over the years a little to not be quite so sweet and shy. But she was very polite in response, answered him seriously, even though she knew full well that the question was meant to be baiting and derogatory. But she was approved along with these other women. So here's the actual historical record in the Mississippi Conference Journal for 1975. Received as probationary members there, kind of the middle of the left side, and also ordained deacons, and then admitted as probationary members over on the right. And there's 3 women. And Dale was the one that persisted. So in 1977, LaRue and Dale graduated from Candler, and she was appointed to the Wesley Foundation at the University of Southern Mississippi as the director. And thus, she was not the pastor of the congregation. Now, this was a valid ministerial appointment. We've got a Wesley Foundation director here tonight. But I think it's fair to say that the conference did not know what to do with a woman and avoided appointing her to a church or a charge. She had a good experience at Southern for that year, especially with the students, but she found a hostile environment in the district. The DS didn't really want to deal with her. One minister told her one day, "Don't think you're going to take over." And he wasn't joking. So she got resistance from men, but also from some women, including some ministers' wives. And as she explained it decades later, a clergywoman in that time and place threatened everybody else's place in the structure. It was a culture that depended on everyone knowing their place. This ought to sound familiar to y'all, I think, if you're from the South. Everyone knowing their place and staying in it. If anyone is different and doesn't fit in, it's a threat. So, based on the affirmation that Dale had received from her professors and other folks in seminary, and in her first quarter of clinical pastoral education, she had envisioned herself in a large church as a pastoral counselor, also serving some pastoral duties, but she saw that as more in keeping with her gifts. Her marriage to LaRue ended in 1978, And she returned to Atlanta to pursue clinical pastoral education to be certified as a supervisor in clinical pastoral education. And she became a hospital chaplain and CPE supervisor, and over 35 plus years trained many, many chaplains and pastoral counselors. She won awards. She had a brilliant career and really found the place to express her gifts and her spiritual commitment and commitment to God and human beings. She was ultimately ordained elder and received as a full connection member in Mississippi after a 2-year delay in 1980. And she believes, and I think she's right, that probably one of the reasons the conference decided to ordain her is because they weren't going to have to deal with her on an appointment basis in a local church. So one of the things she said when I talked with her about 3 years ago was, if you're a minister, you're in good company with what Jesus went through. We're called to love, but we also end up being called to fight. In 1978, backing up a couple of years, the Mississippi Conference ordained 11 deacons, and there in the middle is my wife, and I'm next to her. You notice I did a blow-up of her deacon's ordination certificate because she was listed as Mrs. Betty Clark Reiff. I guess that's another example of sort of systemic language issues where the perception of women then was they were defined by their marital status, their relationship to their husband, etc. In 1979, Frances Cotton, a woman in Mississippi, she was probably in her late 40s, early 50s, was appointed as a lay pastor to assist another minister on the Centerville charge in the Brookhaven district that's down in southwest Mississippi. And I'm going to show you a picture of Frances in just a minute. In 1980, it's a big deal, another clergy couple, well, we were now the only clergy couple because the first one had divorced. But notice, so this picture was in the conference newspaper in 1980. We were about to start serving our first appointments. Notice we're labeled as the Reverend and Mrs. Joseph T. Reiff, in parentheses, Joe and Betty. And I was appointed to the scuba charge in East Mississippi, about 40 miles north of Meridian. And Betty was appointed to Porterville and also to serve the Wesley Foundation at East Mississippi. It's now a community college. If anybody has seen Last Chance U, that's where the first 2 seasons of that are set at East Mississippi Community College. The second year that we were there, we were co-pastors of both charges because of salary issues. Because guess what? Once again, the annual conference didn't really, the bishop and cabinet at least, didn't really know what to do with the woman. So they had found a place for her. They never admitted this, but this is how we interpret it. They found a place for me and then put her nearby at a smaller charge that really didn't need a full-time minister and that didn't pay an appropriate salary for someone who had graduated from seminary. That's a whole other story, which we're not going to get into right now. I love this picture on the left. In 1980, when we first came back from seminary, the conference UMW met on the Gulf Coast, and they invited Betty to preach. I love the picture mostly because of that cross, which is looming over her head. Sort of puts in kind of in image form what Dale was talking about how ministers ultimately end up having to suffer a bit like Jesus did. And we were ordained elder and received into full connection in 1981. Now I want to say that systems struggle with change, and I've already given you plenty of examples of that. But the Mississippi Conference did make some attempts to recognize what was happening. So in 1981, at the 25th anniversary of full clergy rights for women, 1956 to 1981, the conference had a ceremony during annual conference meeting, and Betty spoke. Now, the man on the left is a minister of the conference. The woman next to him is Frances Cotton, who I mentioned a minute ago, who was the first woman to actually serve as pastor in an appointment as a lay pastor. And that's Betty on the right. In between them is Rosemary Schurman, who was a diaconal minister. There was an article in The Advocate that quoted what Betty said, and I want to read it to you. Being a woman in ministry means being somewhat of a pioneer. It means being asked an awful lot to talk about what it means to be a woman in ministry. And it means having scripture quoted at you quite often, and sometimes being called a wolf in sheep's clothes and told I need to repent and be saved. Every day, someone questions what I'm doing. I have to prove myself in a way that most clergymen don't feel they have to do. I know this is part of the newness of what God is doing in the church. Now, I didn't include one other thing that she said, which I think is important to add. She said, I'm excited by the love and support I have received from lay people on my charge and my husband's charge, and they did. They supported us fully. From other clergy and from leaders in the conference. She called on delegates of the conference to support young women as well as men who are trying to discern God's will for their lives and to support women when they feel the call to ordained ministry. So we stayed in Kemper County for 2 years. We moved to Jackson. Betty had a year leave of absence because our second child was born. And then she was appointed to a church in West Jackson. She was there for 2 years, a very tough experience for her, a lot of resistance. But even though kind of the powers that be in the church basically voted her out after, the second year, wanted her to move, she did have her supporters in the church. And there was a young man who at the time was training to be a doctor who told her on one of her last Sundays, "You have showed me another side of God." So there were some folks who were willing to receive what was going on. Very quickly, North Mississippi numbers continued to grow. That's Ruth Wood seated on the right. Mary John Dye in 1983 was appointed the first cross-racial appointment in Mississippi. She was appointed to serve Raspberry United Methodist Church in Indianola, which is in the Delta, and that's an African-American church. So here's the list of the women elders and full connection members received in both Mississippi conferences before 1989. I cut it off there because 89 was when the two conferences merged. And so you see a total of 12 in North Mississippi and a total of 8 in Mississippi. Emma McNair in Mississippi was the first African-American full connection woman. There were 2 shortly after in North Mississippi who were ordained. So, and at the time, there were an additional 14 women who were probationary members and deacons in the 2 conferences together. I got to tell you this story. This is Vicki Laughlin Johnson, who was, her name was on that list I just showed you in Mississippi. Was ordained elder in 1988, served as a pastor for years, was a district superintendent in the early 2000s, and she's now retired. Betty and I left in 1985. I was at annual conference in 1993 because I was still a member of that conference. And Vicki preached a sermon at a worship service one morning. She was starting to tell a story, and she said, "One Sunday I was preaching, and I was 8.5 months pregnant. You men preachers remember what it's like to preach when you're 8.5 months pregnant, don't you?" Well, that got a big laugh. And once I thought about it a little bit, I said, you know, that's a sign that women in ministry are starting to become more normal in this conference. Mississippi got its first woman district superintendent in 1992, Becky Youngblood. This is a picture from when she was ordained. She's on the front row there, second from the left. She was ordained deacon in 1977. She began serving churches in 79, and she was named a district superintendent in Mississippi in 1992. You see that Holston beat Mississippi by about 6 months with their first, and there, of course, there are other conferences, but I just did it up through Mississippi here. Now, in 1991, Becky and I left Mississippi in 1985. I went back to do a PhD at Emory. She served as the financial aid director at Campbell School of Theology. I was hired by Emory and Henry to teach religion in 1990. And Betty became associate pastor at Abingdon United Methodist Church, and she was there for 14 years. We both eventually transferred to Holston. Long story, but I transferred back after Betty retired in 2007. I went to the annual conference in Mississippi in 1991, one combined conference by then, and was present at the ordination service when all these folks were ordained. 21 elders were ordained, 7 of them were women. I thought the reign of God maybe had come. Especially since I remembered that just 6 years earlier, how lonely it was in the Mississippi conference for the only 5 women who were full connection elders in Mississippi. Now, I'm sure that all of these women had their struggles in their pursuit of ordination and in ministry as well. And by the way, I want to point out in the picture on the left, you see the third from the left, there's an African-American man standing above an African-American woman. Y'all are familiar with Stacey Abrams in Georgia. That's her parents, Robert and Carolyn Abrams. They are now retired, but they were ministers in the Mississippi Conference for many years. So by 1995, 44 women had been received in full connection in Mississippi Methodism as a whole. 35 white, 9 African American. A few of them had left the conference by then, but this is everyone who had been ordained. And I'm just going to go on and shift to the next slide because it shows what that says a little better. So this is a kind of a historical statistical comparison. Note that in Mississippi in 1981, there were 359 full connection elders. That's what FE means. 2 of them were women. So that's about 1/2 of 1%. In 2019, 591 full connection elders in the Mississippi Conference. 264, 44.7% are women. And ministers in all categories, which counts full-time and part-time local pastors, lay pastors, and associate members, the percentage of women is 37.3% in 2019. So here we are back at the picture I showed you at the beginning, the 2011 service, Michelle Schrader's ordination by Hope Morgan Ward, Bishop Hope Morgan Ward, with Keith Tonkel standing by. 5 years later, in 2016, which was the 60th anniversary of the granting of full clergy rights to women in the Methodist Church, at the ordination service, Ruth Wood, that is Ruth Wood in her early 90s, was asked to assist in the service. Now, those of you who are Holstonians ought to recognize both of those bishops in that picture. One on the right is Clay Lee, who was bishop here from 88 to 96. He's a Mississippian. He lives in Jackson now. And the other is Bishop Swanson, who is currently the bishop in Mississippi. And by the way, first African-American bishop to serve as bishop for white congregations in the history of Mississippi Methodism. But Ruth assisted in the service. Ruth died this year, about 2 months ago, at the age of 95. And at the annual conference, which was on Zoom in June, we approved a resolution for the celebration of female clergy and the remembrance of the life of Reverend Ruth Wood. And here's the therefore be it resolved. That all the churches in the Mississippi Annual Conference are actively committed to the full inclusion of women in all aspects of ministry. That the first Sunday of June, beginning in 2022, be designated as Celebration of the Call Sunday in memory of Reverend Ruth Wood and in honor of our sisters in ministry. And that these days be given to prayer, celebration, and a renewed commitment to the affirmation of female pastoral leadership and the encouragement of the call to clergy service in the lives of our youth and young adults. I threw a lot of stuff out there, so.
That one on?
You ready to go ahead?
I think you're good.
Okay. Yes, sir.
When was the first black woman appointed to a white, largely or predominantly white church? And actually for a man too, a black man.
In Mississippi.
In Mississippi.
In the Mississippi Annual Conference, the first cross-racial appointment was in the mid-90s. The church on the coast, an African-American man was appointed to a white church. Actually, one of the women on the list there, one of the earliest
It's me.
ordained in the Mississippi Conference, Carol Burnett, was appointed to serve on a black charge with an African-American man. That they were, I guess she was his associate or whatever. That was in the 80s, the mid-80s. I think there has been perhaps one black woman as an associate at a white church in Mississippi. I'm not sure, but it hasn't happened often, but it has happened. So he asked about cross-racial appointments in Mississippi, both men and women.
Can I turn my mic on now? We'll just share.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
I'm vaccinated. Okay. Okay, these are questions from our YouTube, our webinar audience.
And by the way, at least one of the women that I mentioned in this presentation was on the webinar. I think Virginia Allen was on it.
Okay.
Hi, Virginia.
Well, to put in context, I looked at the last numbers I could find for Holston Conference. It was 2019, and we had 25% clergy women.
Mm-hmm.
So Mississippi is ahead of Holston.
Well, and if I do pursue this as a book, one of the ways I think that one of the things I need to do is to try to, dig down into that a little bit. I suspect that one of the reasons for the growth, percentage-wise, is that, in the full connection elder total, they count all the retired ministers. So there's a lot of white ministers from my parents' generation who have died in the last decade. So that's one reason, but it's not the only reason. And I can't help but think that having a woman as bishop from 2004 to 2012 probably had some influence as well.
Okay, one of the questions from our internet audience, why do you think it was such a threat to the conference to have women preachers when John Wesley himself supported women preachers?
Yes, John Wesley did support women preachers to an extent. That's a complicated history. But I'll accept that premise. I think that, first of all, just because a founder says something in particular doesn't mean that everybody's going to be guided by it. And like I started off saying, the Methodist ministry was a male world. Women who sought to enter it had difficulty. And, you know, a lot of times, well, sometimes it definitely was conscious resistance. Often it was conscious resistance. But sometimes it was unconscious resistance. You're used to certain things, and change is difficult. Nobody likes to change. I don't like to change. Does anybody in here like change, really, fully? It's difficult. And, you know, well, I think it's okay to tell this story. When Betty went to her consultation for her appointment in Jackson, her second appointment, I was there. There was a woman on the PPR committee who, I mean, it was clear she did not want a woman pastor. And she was throwing up all sorts of things. Like she was saying, well, there's just certain things that a woman, you know, needs a male pastor to tell. And I shouldn't have done this, but gosh, when I was in my 20s, I did a lot of things I shouldn't have done. And I said, I just couldn't resist it. I said, I just laughed. I said, there were women on both of the charges that we served in Kemper County who told Betty things they would never dream of telling me. So, you know, there was resistance. I think that why question is a larger question, and certainly a book about this would need to deal with it more fully.
Speaking of resistance, is there a difference between how congregations react and then how the cabinet reacts? You said a couple times the conference, and I've heard it at this conference, the conferences didn't know what to do with women.
Yeah.
Were churches more willing to receive women, and how did that work?
That is an excellent question. So I would say first that on the conference level, the cabinet, the bishop, you're talking systemic issues. Now, not that there aren't systemic issues in congregations, there certainly are. But I think it depends on the congregation. I think that, you know, I think Ruth Wood was accepted wherever she went. You know, got over those first few humps about what people supposedly were saying about her calling. I love this story. When she served at Box Chapel Church as the sole pastor for 8 years in Corinth. And when she was about to leave there was a girl in the congregation who was about 7 years, and Ruth was all she'd ever known as a preacher. So it was announced who was following Ruth, and it was a man. And this little girl went to her mother seriously and said, Mama, I just don't know if a man can be a preacher. You know, I mean, a lot of it has to do with our experience. Our congregations, I mean, Betty started at Portable. They loved her pretty much from the get-go. Oh, I got to tell this too. So when the Portable and Chapel Hill, when the Portable Charge found out they were getting a woman pastor about a month and a half before we moved there, the district superintendent had called whoever he called, and they had a church supper that night. And so people were just, we're getting a woman preacher, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And they were just, you know, talking. And there was a couple there who lived in Meridian, where Betty grew up. And the husband of the couple had grown up in this community. And people kept talking, and they said the name once or twice. And finally his wife, Janelle, lived in Meridian, said, what's her name again? And they said, Betty Reiff. She said, oh, that's Bubba and Marie's daughter. The Boyds had been Betty's parents' next door neighbors when they first moved to Meridian. So that, it's like, you know, now she wasn't some weird woman. She was somebody that people they knew. And I think that made a huge difference. But it really does depend on the congregation, and especially the leadership in the congregation. In Betty's second appointment, I think it would have gone a lot better if there hadn't been a few folks who had a lot of power in the church who just were not going to accept her. So, and I've never actually heard this, but I've heard stories about occasionally lay people will, in talking with each other, will say things, and they're talking about conference and how the conference works and everything, and someone will say, you better be careful, if you get in trouble, they'll send you a woman preacher. I don't know if that happens too much anymore, but 20 years ago, that was pretty common, actually. So, but again, I think it depends on the congregation and on the leadership in the congregation.
And the leadership of district
Oh,
superintendents.
yeah,
have a
indeed.
very-
Oh, yes. Let me have a shout out for our DS in the West Jackson district when Betty was appointed to that church. Bill Watkins, may he rest in peace. He stood behind her 100% all the time. We could not have had a better DS than Bill in that situation. His daughter is now a pastor in the Mississippi Conference. So.
The superintendent who introduces the minister makes a huge difference.
Yep.
And I'll tell a sad story. Same time I was appointed, my first appointment, a colleague, the DS, when they told that they were probably going to get a woman, this is another clergy woman, and there was grumbling, and the DS said, well, it's just the way things are now. You're either going to get a woman or a black. Like which do you want a woman or a black? As if that, and what a painful experience. I'm not going to share it, but so that was a district superintendent, I'll say in recent history, because that was mid-'80s. It's very recent history. Whereas my district superintendent made the two churches I was appointed to, made it sound like the bishop had handpicked them to welcome a woman, and they were modeling for the conference. And I know if I'd been in that other DS, it was just, anyway, the way we were objective, a black or a woman.
Can I say something about that?
Yes.
I interviewed 2 African-American pastors in the Mississippi Conference a couple of years ago. Both of them have served as district superintendents. And one of them,
Or just hold it closer to you.
oh, I'm sorry, is that better? Okay. And so both were district superintendents. One of them said they had had churches tell them, as a black woman DS, not to send them a black or a woman. And, didn't realize the irony of their saying that, I think. So it's, now, that DS had no business being a district superintendent of the United Methodist Church. I'm sorry.
Things are better.
Yeah.
Now, things are better, but that was just, so what percentage now of the Mississippi Conference cabinet and extended cabinet is currently female?
Oh, I should have done my homework on that. I think there are 11 districts, and I think there's at least 3 or 4 women, and I never can remember the new titles in the conference structure, but the person who basically runs annual conference and all that as clergy is a woman as well. That's Becky White. I named her in the presentation as well. So it's been pretty, and the cabinet has several African Americans too, women and men.
Are there questions in here? I know you've mentioned the time. It started a little later, which was just the internet's problem.
I just wanted to say something that this church congregation has been here in downtown Knoxville since 1816. And 204 years later, we got our first woman senior pastor.
Yes.
And I'm so thankful.
Yes.
And I will say there, before me, I counted up at least 14 or 15 clergy women who've served here as associate pastors. So I appreciate those paving the way.
I want to tell y'all that when I was here 5 years ago, wow, was I impressed with your associate ministers, male and female.
I think Barbara Clark was one of those.
Yes, she
I just wanted to note that Emily Sanford in the chat.
Hi,
has
Emily.
noted-
She's a clergywoman in Mississippi, yes.
She's noting that 45%, 5 out of 11 DS, and 1 other female director of connectional
Yes,
ministries
that's,
are on these.
thank you. Yeah.
Can you say that, or you could,
So-
Amy, say that again?
So, Emily Sanford, a clergywoman in Mississippi, corrected my lack of knowledge. 5 of 11 DSs are women, and the director of connectional ministries is also a woman. And that's usually a clergy position as well. So basically half of the cabinet. Thank you, Emily.
I think I'll just say what's interesting in your research, because statistics are important. We say this many women, and each year this many women that happen, but to take time to dig up those stories and to hear the conversations and the frustrations and there's nothing, we don't have anything for you, honey, which is the
Darling.
or darling, we can't find anything for you. But, so thank you for taking time to realize that there are stories behind each of those appointments, and that there are struggles and support. I know clergy women truly appreciate great support of congregations and family.
Yeah,
Taking time to ask those questions.
I think one of the links between this and the Born of Conviction Project is that I really sought to tell the stories of the signers of Born of Conviction and some other folks too, and that's what I wanted to hear. There have been several books published about clergy women over the years. The vast majority of them are by sociologists, and I don't have anything against sociology. That was part of my graduate school training, but that tends to be a little more on the statistics. Not just, they a lot of qualitative research, some stories, I think. So if I do pursue this further, I do want to get more stories, a lot more stories. I've interviewed about 10 clergy women so far. I haven't actually interviewed my wife yet. I guess I better do that. And Terry Bailiff, who I mentioned, is actually coming to visit us this week, and I'm going to interview her if she'll agree to it. I think she will. But.
Just want to make one more note. Ruth Owen has noted in the chat that your late father, Joe,
Yes.
Dr. Lee Reiff, and I were members of the very first COSRO in the Mississippi Conference.
Yes, so that's a note from Ruth Owen, who was married to Dale Owen until 1978. Very good friend of ours. He was saying that he and my dad were on the first Commission on the Status and Role of Women in the Mississippi Conference. And Dale Owen was the chair of that body. And that she took more than one opportunity to point out some pretty obvious sexism and didn't make any friends for doing that. But she felt like she needed to do that. So, yes.
Any other questions? Any other questions in here? Or?
Well, I appreciate.
I can't read your lips. I can't read your lips. Oh, is it time to end?
I
Okay.
appreciate everybody's patience with our technical struggles, et cetera. It seems like that's always going to happen no matter where you are. And thanks for listening.
Thank you.